Okay. So Johan has pointed out the ubiquity of empires in their ever-morphing shapes to the present day. I want to talk about how empires worked. Even if, as Johan says, there might be a backlash against studying empire or global history or world history, it's fair to say that studies of empire have been the most productive and exciting and subversive of received paradigms of any of the burgeoning subfields that we heard about in history 2 weeks ago with Marla and Zach. So let's start with definitions. What is an empire? It's a large geographical territory. It's generally multi-ethnic or multi-religious or multicultural or all of the above, ruled by a claim of a single sovereign power. It can be territorially contiguous, like the Roman Empire, the Russian one, the Ottoman one. Or it can be an overseas empire like the French in Africa and the British in India in the modern day. So why do sovereign powers create empires? For economic exploitation. It basically comes down to economics. You get human resources, you get material resources, you get taxation, fiscal resources, you can control trade routes and harbors and rivers. You can create markets for industrial products. Empire has been the most common form of sovereign political organization throughout world history. And as Johan said, it and its legacies persist today. Russia and China are still territorial empires for all intents and purposes. America uses imperial strategies in wielding global economic, military, and political power around the world. So studies of empires give us some fascinating perspectives on how you rule such big, diverse territories. Some of the challenges to imperial centers are the following. How do you inform and teach your colonial subjects about your claim to sovereign power? How do you make them obey? How much power do you need to run an empire, and where is that power lodged? And from the colonial subject's point of view, is it all bad? How can he or she make the best of the situation, and how can they resist? So first of all, how do you rule such territories? Johan gave us 3 ways of assessing empire, a positive one, a negative one, and the middle ground one. I'll give you another triad about imperial governance. A recent book, which I'll advertise because it's written by 2 previous CASBS fellows, Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper. Jane is a Russianist, Fred is a Africanist. They wrote a book called Empires in World History, and they suggest that there are at least two or three models of imperial governance. The important thing about these models, they argue, is that they aren't time-bound. There's not a medieval imperial model versus a modern one. They argue that imperial strategies are the same over time. So, for example, strategies of control you might think of as modern have been around for thousands of years. Things like censuses and taxation and technological advances and military modernization, civilizing missions, they've been around since the Romans. And patterns that you might think of as medieval were used by the 19th century European empires, like conquering by shock and awe, or ruling by terror, or ruling by minimal invasiveness. So Burbank and Cooper offer at least 3 big models. One of them is the homogenizing approach to running an empire. It offers citizenship to its people. It tries to homogenize the realm around a single law and a single religion or a single ideological discourse. Although, in fact, race, class, ethnicity often get in the way of actually giving true citizenship. So this is the Roman model, the modern French or British model in the 19th century. Another very pervasive model of imperial governance is what they call the Eurasian or the politics of difference model. This is where below the assertion of imperial sovereign authority, difference is tolerated. So multiple kinds of law, religion, social institutions all thrive. So it's a less intrusive imperial model. It's the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Russian, even you might say the Habsburg Empire. They also mention a Chinese model, which is based around that Mandarin class in the middle. That is, it uses the officials to link the emperor at the top with the population. It doesn't necessarily demand cultural homogeneity, but it makes that claim through the medium of a very long, enduring, homogenized ruling class. The point of all these 3 models is that they work, but they have different long-term consequences for the subject populations. So empire studies finds new and untapped sources and approaches to answer the various questions I just posed above. So for example, the issue of how you broadcast your sovereignty. It has generated a huge literature, not just on the written ideology of the imperial center, but also on how empires used visual means to disseminate it. Historians borrow method from anthropologists, art historians to study symbolism and ritual, pilgrimages, processions, architecture, portraiture, dress, etiquette, urban planning, the built environment, all of that to show how imperial powers devised their stories and made them known. On the issue of power and obedience, there's a lot of good work on local politics and social organization. The center either has to send out administrators trained from the center, and there are never enough of them, or it has to co-opt local elites with land, gifts, office, status. It therefore has to deal with local nobles and middling officialdom ruling in its stead, and so the imperial center is at their mercy to some extent. It has to do what historians call delegating sovereignty, giving up some of its power, notably its monopoly on the use of violence. So local judges get to use the death penalty, or local landlords get to enforce hierarchical institutions like serfdom or slavery. And relying on local communities to staff local government, even with central oversight, usually means that community norms and traditions and practices get integrated into the imperial project. So imperial power looks and feels a little different in all the different corners of the empire. So on the one hand, historians argue that this is not weakness, that this is how empires are stable. Empires are a bricolage of the local people getting enough of what they want so the center can get what it wants. On the other hand, empires have to keep control, and there's a lot of interesting work on this. How empires police their own officials, which is a huge problem. How they try to keep regional elites from coalescing in local power. How they use violence, hopefully strategically at the beginning and minimally throughout control. So that's an important new area of research. Then the many active and passive forms of resistance to empire have also been a rich field, as well as the porous borderlands of empire, places where traders and pilgrims and nomads and slavers gather and create whole different hybrid cultures on the edges. So empire studies open up fascinating information and questions. So now I have some concluding reflections. Thinking micro. Empires were the context in which most people historically spent their lives, and the range of their life experiences was quite wide because, as a rule, imperial power is relatively weak. For the sake of discussion, I would point out the positive aspects of empires. Many were stable over several centuries precisely because they accepted and managed diversity and they ruled with a light hand. Thinking macro. Empire studies encourages us to rethink big theoretical issues like, for example, sovereignty. So I'd like to hear your responses, in fact, to some of these problems. So what does sovereignty mean when it's routinely delegated into the hands of ill-educated judges and illiterate landlords? Or the issue of power. How do you measure imperial power when it's so dispersed? And legitimacy. How do imperial rulers and elites, who are almost always foreigners of a different culture, language, religion, whatever, from their subjects' people, how do you establish legitimacy after conquering your way to power? And finally, the nation. We have a myth that in the 19th and 20th centuries, those centuries witnessed the rise of nations and the end of empire. And hardly. I would say that that is basically only a myth. Nationalism is the myth, the governing myth around which states have tried to organize in Europe since about the 16th century. But that it's a myth that ignores the historical diversity of the peoples within almost every nation. In fact, writing your national history usually means writing out a lot of aspects of that history. And actually trying to create your national history involves more than writing out. It usually means death and destruction. Trying to create a unitary, ethnically focused nation on the grounds of a collapsed multi-ethnic empire has produced in the 20th century, 21st, in places like Africa, Yugoslavia, the former Soviet Union, it has produced genocide, population movements, forced population movements, wars, terrorism, linguistic purification campaigns, disenfranchisement, etc. So exploring how empires in the past have balanced diversity with central control might perhaps encourage today's policymakers to create more tolerant nations. Thank you.